Good afternoon, class. Welcome back. I'm going to make a few comments about the sort of earliest arrival of human inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere. And in some ways, this is, I think, it helps us sort of understand that when we use the term Native American, we aren't necessarily referring to a group of people who had little to no, or even minimal impact upon the natural environment. Part of the theme of this week is that as we look at the experience of the Pueblo, we look at the experience of the Mi'kmaq and the Plains societies, Native Americans, of the pre-European periods in the history of the Western Hemisphere, we're going to realize that they used their natural environment, and they used it even intensively in some cases. And we just have to be careful. Still, modes of production and ideas and parables of meaning are important here, but we have to note that really, regardless of who the humans are, we all, through the process of meeting our needs for survival, we impact our natural environment. That is not to say that all impacts are or should be thought of in the same degree, because there are some very meaningful distinctions of degree. But this is our objective for today. I already introduced you to it, so I'm just showing it here. I'm going to move on. We talked a little bit today. We began talking about the Haida creation myth and this idea of how it's really instructive or meaningful to think about when you ask someone where they're from. We can get some really different explanations. Native peoples are good examples. Almost without exception, tribal peoples have a story, and it's a sacred story that gives meaning to their lives and who they are as a people. And perhaps similarly, that we can say the same of Europeans, but as the European mindset is largely descended from the Enlightenment and thought tradition, an intellectual tradition that values science to explain in convincing terms, I should put that in air quotes, in convincing terms, who we are and where we came from. As far as the past 100 years goes, a very strong and rather consistent case has been made to use the theory of the Bering land bridge, or the Strait, the Beringia, the land bridge that connected Eurasia with North America, going back as long as 15,000 years ago and ending around 10,000 years ago when the glaciers began to retreat at the end of the Pleistocene era. Okay, and we talked about how one of the most important events, and again, we're still in the theoretical realm here, but there is a fair amount of evidence to point to the fact that 11,000 to 10,000 years ago, there is a very dramatic event for the natural environment, and we witnessed the widespread extinction of numerous species. 35 genera of mammals. Now what that means, most of you are probably familiar with genus and species. We humans, we are of the genus Homo and the species Sapien. Genera just refers to, it's the plural of genus. So that means at a fairly high level, animals, mammals, not just genus and species, but genus, the genera. 35 genera were wiped out, and that is a pretty significant number. And you can see a little list here: mastodons, giant sloths, armadillos, camels, capybara, tapir, beaver, horse, bear, etc. And these were, we generally refer to these as megafauna because they were so large. They were much larger than their more contemporary cousins, their family members. Much larger than a cougar today, or even a beaver today, or a bear. These were gigantic mammals, megafauna. Okay, so theories about this. I started to talk about this in class today. One of the most probably widely recognized or widely debated theories is that of Paul Martin, who put forward the Blitzkrieg theory. He did this in 1967, and of course, in 1967, we were a good 20 years past World War II, and the phrase Blitzkrieg took on new meaning during World War II because that was the style of warfare carried out by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi army, Hitler's Nazi army, during World War II. And Blitzkrieg essentially meant the style of warfare was to bring a preponderance of force on a single area. So you just concentrate tremendous force. This is kind of like a forebear of shock and awe. Maybe you've heard that phrase if you've studied American military history of late. But the idea is that you use overwhelming force on a small area and then you move in and take that over. So this has been applied to, Martin applied this to the theory of the Pleistocene extinctions, where he states that man and man alone caused the Pleistocene extinctions. The idea being that humankind came into a virgin continent where the mammals had little to no understanding or grasp of the human presence, and therefore fell prey, and relatively easy prey, to their smart human opponents. Humans were able to prevail over mammals, feed themselves, and deplete the total numbers of mammals in a fairly short period of time. So Martin does this by putting together a formula whereby he starts from a number of, say, 100 immigrants, and over the next 10,000 years, if these small groups of people, at least they start off small, migrating 20 miles per year to meet their requirements for hunting, and if each human consumes 12 animals during that time, the population doubles every 20 years. You wind up some centuries later with 100,000 people that have spread 2,000 miles and killed 90 million animals. That's a lot of animals. But Martin's theory tries to explain why there would be a demand for this many animals and how that demand would be sufficient to creating these widespread extinctions. Now, I've done the math on that. I don't exactly understand how 300 years at 20 miles per year equals 2,000 miles. That doesn't make much sense to me either if you're baffled by that. But the point is that there is slow but steady spread, and within 1,000 years, maybe a little longer, humans are going to people the entire continents, or the entire landmass of the Western Hemisphere, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. Now, of course, historians love to have vigorous debates, and there has been a vigorous debate surrounding Martin's theory of Blitzkrieg. And one of the challenges is that there are not that many archaeological sites that demonstrate extinct megafauna, and particularly extinct megafauna where there is evidence of a human presence. But there have been instances where we've seen arrowheads, which this picture is intended to portray. Also, where we have seen human-shaped and sharpened. In this case, we have, it looks like a blade or a skinning tool. So there has been some evidence. Clovis technology, these long, big, sharpened stone heads, are consistent with the Clovis people, which were a prehistoric people in the Western Hemisphere. And they also used, I'm not going to click on this, but if you want to go see a really interesting primitive tool, you could follow this link. It's an atlatl, and it's essentially like a predecessor of the bow and arrow, and it involves using a wrist. This is an atlatl here, a wrist device where you extend it and it sort of launches a long spear. And a good atlatl, someone who's practiced it, can use it with devastating effect. It can be very accurate, and it can generate quite a bit of force and make it a successful thing. Other sort of problems is that with Martin's theory, some suggest that it downplays the fact that humans, the earliest immigrants to the Western Hemisphere, would have also employed other strategies, such as, gathering, which would have meant less damage to those megafauna and maybe wouldn't explain the numbers that Martin puts forward. And then a final piece of sort of countervailing evidence or evidence used to discredit Martin's theory is that there were also there were widespread extinctions of species that were not these megafauna. In fact, animals, mammals that weren't necessarily of interest to the earliest immigrants in terms of the food that they would need to survive. And if that's the case, maybe it suggests that there was something else, perhaps climate, that was the culprit, or at least a contributing factor to the widespread Pleistocene extinctions. But nonetheless, it's really interesting that we see efforts by environmental historians to, at really the earliest junctures of humans' presence in the Western Hemisphere, trying to understand the changes that happen to the natural environment and to what degree humans may or may not be responsible for those. And part of this is, are humans capable of creating such a disturbing impact upon the natural environment going back thousands of years? Or is the climate a more powerful and contributing aspect to this? Okay? All right. Going a little bit deeper, I just want to close with some questions here. We have to ask ourselves, when we think about the human history and its impact upon the natural environment, we can go back and see thousands of years ago how Native Americans really used their land, used their natural environment, and used it in a somewhat intense way, whether it was fire to, sometimes fire was used as a tool of hunting. Of course, later on it's going to become a tool of agriculture to return nutrients to the soil. Irrigation, as we turn our attention to the Pueblo tomorrow, will be a part of this. Deforestation, clearing the land to open up more space for horticulture and later on agriculture. So this is really interesting, and it maybe begs the question of, when we use the term Native American, what exactly do we mean by that? Does it have a useful historical is it historically useful? I'm inclined to think that it is, but we probably should be careful about what we mean by that, because really, if we step back, there are countless ways in which humans are just humans, and Native Americans are motivated by some of the same things that European Americans will be motivated by. The question is are there meaningful distinctions? And this week we'll be looking at some of those rather meaningful distinctions. Thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.